Hey class, AP US history. It's kind of awkward. I'm not really sure how to begin this, but I'm just going to dive into it headlong. I'm going to make a bunch of mistakes. I'm sure you understand why. This is new and different for me, but I'm kind of excited to try something new. So what I'm going to be doing is, as of right now, going through lecture just like I normally would. I'm going to do it on PowerPoint, and it'll be you'll be able to see it. I'll put a link on Classroom, Google Classroom, and hopefully it'll go smoothly. So without further ado, let's just jump right into it. Let me make me smaller here, as I'm sure you probably don't want to see me. But I'm going to start out by talking about LBJ, doing a quick review of what we covered earlier in class last time we met. So I talked about how the moment when LBJ came on TV, millions of people watched, and he used their mantra of "We shall overcome." What happened at Selma? This was right after the incident at Selma, the walk between Selma and Montgomery, where the protesters were met with firearms and batons and state troopers and local police, and it was an awful scene. And a lot of people saw it on TV. And President Johnson was just as appalled as most people in the United States that he came out and gave the speech about what happened at Selma, concerned all Americans who must overcome the crippling legacy of bigotry and injustice. And the most important part of his speech was when he said, "We shall overcome." So that kicked off a lot more protests for sure. We talked about the Voting Rights Act of 1965, how big that was. That was a big part of LBJ's Great Society. It was getting rid of poll taxes and literacy tests and intimidation, but it was just an acknowledgement by the United States government that they were going to do something about what was going on, and it's the first time that anything like that has happened since Civil War period. Right, after the Civil War, as a matter of fact, after Reconstruction, and specifically after the Compromise of 1877. So this Voting Rights Act is eventually going to lead to the 24th Amendment eliminating the poll tax in federal elections. We also discussed the other day the Black Power movement and all these different aspects of the Black Power movement. We looked at the Watts riots and the hot summer of the 1965 protest against police brutality, protest against not segregation, but discrimination in Southern California. We looked at the rise of Malcolm X in his influence, originally part of Elijah Muhammad's Black Muslim movement, the Nation of Islam, eventually broke away from that and became more mainstream, more along the lines of Martin Luther King, and was tragically killed on February 21st, 1965, by three African American Muslims. We looked at the Black Power movement, specifically in Oakland, and again, they were protesting police brutality against African Americans, and it's a militant group founded in 1966 in Oakland, led by Huey Newton and Bobby Seale. We also in class, last time we met, discussed the assassination of Martin Luther King, allegedly by James Earl Ray. He was convicted, but he recanted his conviction, and I told you too that Coretta Scott King, Martin Luther King's widow, did not believe that he was the one who actually killed Martin Luther King. So it's still a bit of a mystery, but the nation was robbed of the civil rights leader, Martin Luther King. He was the most influential of his time. We talked about different aspects of communism, specifically the Vietnam War, and it's going to lead to the movement of the Doves and the Hawks, and the issues that were brought up there. The Doves tended to be liberal, young, formerly, children of the 1950s, the baby boomers, they were liberal and they didn't support the Vietnam War. And you had the war hawks that tended to be conservative, older generation that was against the protesters. So Johnson was caught in the middle, and there was a growing credibility gap between what the government was actually saying and what the people thought. They were afraid that they weren't getting the full story. So they believed that there was a credibility gap between what was actually happening and what the government was saying specifically, and the amount of troops that were being sent over to Vietnam to fight the war. We talked about the protests. The Vietnamese monk burned himself in Saigon. A couple more of the things that we covered here regard to the protests. We talked about the new left, similar to this gentleman here. They're anti-draft, they're pro-civil rights, they're anti-traditional value. I use the term anti-disestablishmentarianism. They rebelled with sex, drugs, and rock and roll. We also discussed the Tet Offensive, the Vietnamese New Year, when the North Vietnamese invaded the South and made some headway for a little while. They were eventually pushed back. But the main thing about the Tet Offensive is the scope of the war in Vietnam was widened with 200,000 more troops being sent over, and more protests followed because of it. We looked at this, some of this being played out in the media. Americans saw this on TV, the killing of a Viet Cong prisoner. We ended the class talking about the election of 1968. We talked about how brutally violent the year 1968 was, with the death of Martin Luther King, also the death of RFK, and here you had a lot of anger and resentment directed at the Democrats, at the Democrat convention, because Robert Kennedy was, probably the odds-on favorite to win the nomination. In March of '68, LBJ decided he wasn't going to run, so that opened the door for Kennedy to take the helm, and he was very popular, and people were very reminiscent of his brother, and they thought he would make a great president. He sounded a lot like JFK, and he acted a lot like JFK, so people were fondly remembering JFK. And then he was killed by Sirhan Sirhan in Los Angeles in a hotel room. Sirhan Sirhan was upset with the views of the Kennedys in regard to support for the Israelis. And that's the reason that he killed RFK, and he sits in jail to this day. And the last slides I showed you in class was the chaos that followed at the Democrat nominating convention. Okay, so new stuff. This is the new stuff that you haven't seen yet. Hopefully you're keeping up with your reading. Please do keep up with that reading. It'll always be on RenWeb. We're going to today finish off this chapter. So the election of 1968, it was Richard Nixon who's running again. He ran in '60 and was defeated by Kennedy. So his vice president was a man by the name of Spiro Agnew, and the Democrats nominated Hubert Humphrey from Minnesota. You also had the American Independent Party who nominated the racist George Wallace, who wanted to bomb Vietnam into oblivion, and one of his mantras was segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever. He was from Alabama, so he was in the deep South, and he was incredibly racist. Later on, this man will eventually become governor of Alabama for a long time. Someone shoots him at one point. He's paralyzed. So he lived the rest of his life in a wheelchair, but he remained as governor. He did change his ways. He claimed to change his ways. He wasn't for segregation later on. But here, the victory is going to go to Nixon. he's a minority president, meaning didn't um, he didn't win 50% of the popular vote, which we've seen quite a bit of in history, as we've talked about. Talk a little bit about LBJ and his legacy. I think his lasting legacy would be his support for civil rights. A Southerner from Texas coming out for civil rights was big. His war on poverty, helping out in Appalachia, that was big. What hurts him? Vietnam. The increase in the number of troops that were sent over, the credibility gap, the whole debate between hawks versus doves really dragged down his presidency. The other thing, financially, and we know that Americans oftentimes vote their pocketbook, inflation hurt him desperately. Because you know, and we've talked about it in almost every war that we've discussed, that war tends to bring on inflation. And this inflation was caused specifically by spending on the war and also the war on poverty, which created this inflation. And we'll talk more about that in a few minutes here. LBJ returned to his Texas ranch and he died there in 1973. Just show you some pictures from the 1960s. Kind of fun to look at some of these pictures and the way people dressed and what some of the things that they did. Some of the music there with the Doors and Jimi Hendrix. Woodstock was big in New York. People just all of a sudden just had a big, huge festival in Woodstock, New York, and there were thousands and thousands of people that were there. Some images from Woodstock. Cover of Life magazine. Okay, now let's switch over a little bit to Nixon. And we've talked about different doctrines from Truman to Kennedy, to Eisenhower to Kennedy, all having their doctrines, so to speak. Nixon, I guess he considered it to be his Nixon doctrine. It was called Vietnamization. And it was a way to get out of Vietnam because it was, very unpopular in the United States. So this idea of Vietnamization was gradually handing over control of the Vietnam War to the South Vietnamese, teaching them, paying them money, trying to get them prepared to take on this battle by themselves. There were 540,000 American troops over there, and we were going to gradually pull them out. It was November 3rd, 1969, Nixon delivered a dramatic televised speech where he talked about the silent majority coming forward. Nixon, being a Republican, was conservative, and to him, the silent majority were what he considered to be the majority of people in the United States that supported the troops, supported the government, and were in support of the war in Vietnam. He was tired of seeing just only the counterculture movement being shown, so he was frustrated by that. So he delivered this dramatic speech about the silent majority he called coming forward. He criticized what he called the effete core of impudent snobs and nattering nabobs of negativism, which, basically he's saying that the kids that are protesting the counterculture movement, they're a bunch of snobs and they're negative, and the media loves to show them. The Vietnam War, was fought generally by the least privileged. We talked about how many African Americans were unfairly called up, were drafted in the military. College students were able to get deferment, so they didn't have to go, or they could put it off until they either graduated or got through a semester. We also discussed how violent 1968 was. I've talked about it numerous different times, and a horrific incident occurred in March of 1968. I'll read it to you here. March of 68, a unit of Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 20th Infantry slaughtered between 200 and 500 unarmed villagers in the hamlet of My Lai, led by Lieutenant William Calley. The platoon was ordered to enter the village firing, which they did. The soldiers had been advised before the attack by Army Command that all who were found in My Lai could be considered VC, which is Viet Cong, or active VC sympathizers, and were told to destroy the village. They acted with extraordinary brutality, raping and torturing villagers before killing them and dragging dozens of people, including young children and babies, into a ditch and executing them with automatic weapons. The massacre reportedly ended when an Army helicopter pilot, Warrant Officer Hugh Thompson, landed his aircraft between the soldiers and the retreating villagers and threatened to open fire if they continued their attack. Calley was found guilty of killing 22 villagers. He was originally given a life sentence but served only 3.5 years under house arrest. So it's an awful mark on the war and what was going on at the time. Some ugly, terrible images of the massacre. Okay, let's switch over and talk about Cambodianizing the war. So, Nixon saying that he wanted Vietnamization was a gradual, pullout, and then the scope of the war seemed to expand when the North Vietnamese had been using neighboring Cambodia as a springboard for funneling troops and arms. They'd go and fire their weapons, they'd attack, and then they'd go to the safe haven that was Cambodia. And so Nixon never consulted Congress and ordered the bombing of Cambodia. And because of the bombing of Cambodia, there were a lot of angry Americans, and there was hysteria because of it. Specifically to the most well-known riots that occurred at this time. The year was 1970. It was Kent State and Jackson State College in Mississippi. And it was more, hawks versus doves. Finally, in 1971, the U.S. Senate repealed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. Just a quick review, if you remember, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution was the blank check that was handed over by Congress to President Johnson to do whatever he needed to do to stop the North Vietnamese after the supposed attack by the North Vietnamese on the Americans in the Gulf off the coast of Vietnam. So the 26th Amendment was passed, also lowering the voting age to 18. The reason they did this is because 18-year-olds were eligible to be drafted in the military, but they weren't old enough to vote. So there was a big debate about that, and Congress agreed and passed the 26th Amendment that means that every state has to allow 18-year-olds to vote. In 1971, the New York Times also published the top secret Pentagon papers that came forward. The papers that had been leaked by a man by the name of Daniel Ellsberg, a former Pentagon official, and exposed the deceit by the Kennedy and Johnson administrations. And it really did prove that this credibility gap that the counterculture groups and the doves were talking about, it really did exist. That behind the back of the public, troops were being sent over to Vietnam. So here's an image from 1970, Kent State. This says Marianne Vecchio gestures and screams as she kneels by the body of the student lying face down on the campus of Kent State University in Kent, Ohio on May 4th, 1970. 4 students died and 9 others were wounded during the student protests against the Vietnam War when the National Guard opened fire. So a horrific incident. Here's more images from that Kent State riot on the campus there. Jackson State, Mississippi also. Here's the Time magazine front page regarding the Pentagon Papers. It says they found that the U.S. government had continually resisted full disclosure of increasing the military involvement in Southeast Asia. Airstrikes over Laos, raids along the coast of North Vietnam, and offensive actions by U.S. Marines had taken place long before American public was informed. Once again, there's that credibility gap that they talked about. Here is Daniel Ellsberg. He's the one who leaked the information. In 1971, Ellsberg precipitated a national uproar when he released the Pentagon Papers, the U.S. military account of activities in Vietnam. The Vietnam veteran and a senior research associate at MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, study for international studies. Ellsberg helped to compile the Pentagon Papers while working in the Defense Department. Initially, he supported the war effort, but later turned against it. His release of the Pentagon Papers succeeded in eroding public support for the war. Let's talk about Nixon and USSR, Russia. as we like to talk about every president when, after the Cold War started and his relationship with the Russians. And Nixon had a different plan. He used Kennedy's word, I guess you could say, détente, French for relaxation, with Beijing. He wanted to have a good relationship with China. Remember, 1949, China turned communist, and that was a big blow to the United States in the Cold War because so many people were now thrust under the communist flag. But Nixon tried to use China as a bit of a buffer. He knew that China and the Soviet Union were clashing over their interpretations of Marx and what communism should and what it should not be. So Nixon seized this opportunity to drive a further wedge between USSR and China. He sent the National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger to China to encourage better relations. Of course, this then really upset the Soviet Union because they got concerned. The question was, why is the United States befriending China? So it made him a bit nervous. Nixon actually became the first president to visit China. He knew that, again, it would upset the USSR, and he used what people were calling his China card. Hey, I'm gonna see if I could create better relations with the Soviet Union by driving a wedge between these two. If the Soviet Union saw the United States talking to, negotiating with China, maybe they'd come to the bargaining table. So it did eventually create good relations with the USSR. A grain deal was signed, anti-ballistic missile treaty was signed, and also the beginning of strategic arms limitation talks. They were called SALT talks, S-A-L-T, SALT, strategic arms limitation. So there's Nixon in China, along the Great Wall of China. So he became a bit of a tourist. When it comes to Nixon, shifting over to talk about Nixon and the Supreme Court, Nixon is a Republican. Republicans tend to be conservative. But a lot of things are going to happen that would make him seem a bit more liberal. So, again, I use the phrase, if you can't beat him, join him. Everybody is understanding how popular FDR was. So even Republicans like Eisenhower and his Highway Act, were very liberal. I don't know if the reason he created that was not because of the creation of jobs, but for protection. But there were other things too, like his stance when it came to dynamic republicanism or dynamic conservatism had to do with being conservative when you're talking about people's money, but liberal when you're talking about dealing with people. So Nixon also, in spite of the fact he was conservative, also had a liberal side. But when it came to the Supreme Court, Earl Warren was a bit more liberal than he thought he should be, than Nixon thought he should be. So the liberalness of the Supreme Court really frustrated Nixon. And it says here that Warren led the court into a series of decisions that dramatically affected sexual freedom, the right of criminals, the practice of religion, and civil rights. So, like coddling of criminals, the court said that all criminals were entitled to legal counsel, even if they were too poor to afford one. The whole Escobedo versus Miranda, which the Supreme Court ruled that the accused could now remain silent. You have the right to remain silent. That all came from, they're called Miranda rights. So giving criminals more rights, Nixon felt was too liberal. So he didn't like coddling of criminals. Warren Burger takes over after the retirement of Earl Warren. He was supposed to be more conservative, as Nixon wanted to appoint someone who was conservative. Obviously, this was a strong Republican. Warren Burger was, but one of the couple of cases that reflected more of a one case for sure that reflected more of a liberal side was Roe v. Wade. the right that women have to have an abortion. And then the Bakke case was where he struck down affirmative action, was a more conservative side of Warren Burger. So two things that we'll be discussing here. The liberalness of Nixon. I mentioned that he can't beat him, join him. Here's a lot of liberal things that he did. He expanded Medicare and Medicaid. They're there for the long haul. He realized it, and he expanded Medicare and Medicaid. That's very liberal, and not a big. Republicans usually weren't big on that, but he did expand it. He boosted aid to families with dependent children. He implemented supplemental Social Security, which gave generous benefits to indigent, aged, blind, and disabled. So he expanded Social Security. He improved it. His Philadelphia plan was a start of affirmative action. Affirmative action has always been a controversial topic, and at the time, think of affirmative action as like with schools, with jobs, they had quotas. They had to have a certain number of African American, Hispanic, Asian, white numbers when it came to schools, when it came to jobs. That's called affirmative action. And you could see where the need for affirmative action would be strong, like say for African Americans going into getting into colleges, getting into getting jobs, good jobs might be difficult because it goes all the way back to the slavery times where African Americans were behind when it came to education, and giving them opportunities. Affirmative action would give them more opportunities. So it was implemented. It was Nixon who implemented it with his Philadelphia plan. That plan will eventually be struck down by Warren Burger in the Alan Bakke case. We'll be looking at that in the next chapter. Nixon also created the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, still around today. There was a book by Rachel Carson called Silent Spring, and exposed poisonous pesticides and played a big role in the creation of the EPA. He also created OSHA, the Occupational Health and Safety Administration, who goes around and checks to make sure that workplaces are safe and healthy places for people to be in. The Clean Air Act of 1970 and the Endangered Species Act of 73 both struck at pollution. Pollution was very bad before in the 60s and 50s and 60s. So opened people's eyes about pollution, and also Endangered Species Act helping protect animals that were dying out. All right, so the election of 1972, Richard Nixon is going to go for a second term, and he's going to win by landslide. Look at that landslide. It's huge. The candidacy of Nixon was given a boost by Henry Kissinger's announcement that peace was at hand at Vietnam. It looked like it was going to be close. They were going to be able to end the war. So people were pretty excited about that. He goes against a man by the name of George McGovern, who promised to end the war within 90 days after his election. And it was a huge landslide victory for Nixon, only to be followed by Watergate. Just looking at some of the biggest landslide victories in history, I know that I get a lot of questions on that. What was the biggest landslide? There's been quite a few. But in 1920, the greatest percentage point margin in the popular vote, Harding at 60.3% and Cox at 34.1%. In 1936, the greatest electoral vote difference between winner and opponent, Roosevelt 523 to Landon's 8. In 1964, the highest percentage for a winner was when LBJ got 61.1% of the popular vote. In 1984, we'll be discussing that election. That's the only one we haven't discussed on this list, but the highest number of electoral votes, Ronald Reagan with 525. Huge landslide victory. All right, so again, there's a Time magazine cover, and it says ceasefire. He being Nixon, ordered a bombing, carpet bombing of the border right there in North Vietnam to try to bring the North Vietnamese to the bargaining table, and that's what happened. And January 23rd, 1973, there was finally a ceasefire. And Americans were excited about that because finally the Vietnam War was over. I mean, they've been sending, as we said before, advisors, and I put air quotes around that. Oh yeah, you could see me, so air quotes. They were sending advisors that were really fighting, but this thing had been going on since then. So that's 13 years. That's a long time, and over 50,000 lives lost during that time. Interestingly enough, here is Everett Alvarez. In our league, we have Everett Alvarez High School named after Everett Alvarez, who's still alive today. He doesn't live locally here, but he visits sometimes. It says here, on a hot, scorching day in 1964, Lieutenant Everett Alvarez was shot down over Vietnam. He was sent to the Hanoi Hilton. It wasn't really a Hilton. And would not know freedom again for almost 9 years, earning the dubious honor of being the longest prisoner of war in Vietnam. Battling personal demons both in the Hilton and back home, Alvarez nonetheless overcame his obstacles, earning the respect of his fellow soldiers and becoming a true legend. So I love to bring in local history. So having Everett Alvarez Jr. up there in my PowerPoint is quite an honor. If you ever want to read a great book, read Chained Eagle, written about, might have been by Everett Alvarez. Great book. Boy, the Arab embargo, the Arab oil embargo and the energy crisis. And the 1970s begins a period of time when the economy goes bad. Earlier, I told you that between 1950 and 1970, we had the longest unchecked economic growth period in American history, followed by the 70s, where everything came crashing down. I oftentimes discuss the golden credit card, where Americans were just spending and spending and spending, and no bill ever came. Well, the bill's going to come in the 1970s. It's going to be a rough time economically for many Americans. And on top of that, OPEC decided to not send oil to the United States over our policy when it came to the Middle East. We supported Israel, and the Arab countries hated that. OPEC got together, said, well, we're not going to send oil to the United States. So what happened was long lines at the gas pump. You could see here. This is now you're entering a period of time when I could remember in the mid-70s. I was a little kid, but I can remember waiting in line at gas stations and getting only $3 worth of gas, and it was really a bad situation in the United States because of the oil embargo. It was very frustrating for a lot of people because of oil. We really realized our dependence on oil. I mean, we've known that since the 50s, but individually, Americans were reminded how important oil was when it comes to gas. The speed limit all over the United States was changed to 55 miles an hour. There was no 70, there was no 65, there was no 60. Everything was 55 miles an hour. And the federal government said it told the states, if you don't change your speed limits, then we're not going to give you highway funds. So all states changed to 55 miles an hour. The reason they did this was to save fuel. And, so if you're driving 55, you're saving gas as opposed to driving 70. You could see the big muscle type cars with the 350 engines and bigger that were very popular in the 1970s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. That all changed. You started seeing small economy cars, Toyota, Honda. They were producing cars that got way better gas mileage than the 6 or 7 miles to the gallon that you probably got from most of the cars that are seen in this picture right here. Okay, so that's the end of this chapter. Sorry about how rough it was. Hopefully they'll get better as we go. Try to bring some interesting things in, and hopefully they get better. But really keep up with the reading. Everything will be on RenWeb, and I'm looking at Friday as the test day. That we're gonna have that test. 33, 34, 35, and 36. I'll create it in AP Classroom, and I'm just now figuring that out. I'll give you some heads up on that. I'll probably send an email out. All right, thanks for listening, guys. Hope you stay safe.